South Korean officials reported on Friday that at least 91 patients thought cleared of the new coronavirus had tested positive again. Korea's Center for Disease Control and Prevention have said that the virus may have been reactivated, rather than the patients being reinfected. But authorities say it remains unclear what is behind the trend and that investigations are still underway. Some experts have suggested that false test results could also be at fault, but may not be infectious or of danger to the host or others. But the prospect of people being reinfected with the virus is of international concern. Many countries are hoping and relying on infected populations developing sufficient immunity to prevent a resurgence of the virus. South Korea on Friday reported its lowest number of new infections after daily cases peaked at more than 900 in late February, and the death toll rose to at least 211.
Here's what else does not help China's cause. Its record. The pictures coming out of China. What is happening in China? Racist attacks and xenophobia on the rise. We've reported about this before, but now it's getting worse, especially in the industrial city of Guangzhou. It's a hub for the African diaspora in Asia, and they are being targeted in China. They're being called the carriers of the virus. Here's a report.
This notice in English is for African visitors. They are not allowed inside this McDonald's joint in Guangzhou. The African community in China is on the edge. They are being targeted. This video, now shared by several international news outlets, shows an African being dragged away. Photographs are going viral. Several Africans were seen living on the streets. Online rumors spread like wildfire in Guangzhou. They claimed that the coronavirus is spreading among the Africans. This led to their mass evictions from hotels and apartments. Xenophobia, or an anti-foreigner sentiment, is driving hate against the African community in China.
They're not even allowing us to. They are just walking on the road. You see, they cannot give us house. They cannot give us hotel. They cannot provide a place we can stay.
Reports say Africans have been subjected to forced testing and quarantine, even when they were showing no symptoms. China is now facing a diplomatic backlash from Africa. Instead of an admission or apology, China chose to target the United States, blaming Washington for creating divisions between China and Africa.
I want to stress that the China-Africa friendship is unbreakable and deeply rooted in China and Africa. After the outbreak of the COVID-19 epidemic, China and Africa once again united to overcome difficulties.
Beijing's attempt at deflection has failed to douse the anger in Africa. Across African capitals, Chinese ambassadors were called for an explanation. The chairperson of the African Union sought answers from the Chinese ambassador. A Nigerian lawmaker didn't hold back his anger against China. He tweeted a video of an exchange with the Chinese ambassador in Nigeria. He began by showing the viral videos of mistreatment. The Chinese diplomat was issued a warning. He faced some direct questions from the lawmaker. The ambassador was struggling to find the right words to respond.
Almost undiplomatic the way I'm talking, but it's because I am actually upset about what's going on. So, I mean, I'm not sure how you want to address this. Have you spoken to your Nigerian counterpart in China? Have you spoken to the Nigerian ambassador in China?
No.
You haven't?
No.
Have you spoken
not
to
on this issue.
I'm talking about this issue. Have you spoken to any official Chinese or the Chinese government in China?
But definitely. We have to, like I promised the foreign minister, we take the very...
No, but you have not.
No, we have done it. But
you spoke to the Chinese government?
No, we're still waiting for because we are here. We don't get the picture, the whole picture. So, but we have to report the concern from Right Honorable Speaker and the Minister. We take it very seriously.
China is trying to control the narrative on the coronavirus outbreak. But its actions are speaking louder than its words. Actions like these. China tried to evade blame by calling the world racist. Now this proof of racism on Chinese soil only exposes it further.
Look at the Chinese police. They won't allow us to rest. They chased us away from our house. We don't have anywhere to live. They are pursuing us. Why?
Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
In 1992, Sprint wanted to build a cell phone tower in the small scenic town of Monument, Colorado. But the public was concerned that the tower would obscure their mountain views. So Sprint hired Larson Camouflage, a company known for creating artificial natural environments for Disney parks, zoos, and museum exhibits. Their solution was the monopine. Larson Camouflage has gone on to conceal thousands of cell towers since, using the monopalm, monoelm, cypresses, and cactuses. Across the United States, cell towers have been concealed in flagpoles, street lamps, water towers, art installations, and even church steeples. But these disguises aren't really fooling anyone, are they? They're also pretty expensive, adding up to $100,000 extra to the cost of building a cell tower. We see so many of these fake cell tower trees thanks in part to efforts to combat visual pollution. Things like billboards, crowded highway signage, antennas, and wires. But is visual pollution really pollution, or just a fancy name for an eyesore? In 2009, Notre Dame law professor John Copeland Nagel learned of a potential new cell phone tower proposed for his town. Nagel went on to write a paper about whether pollution is the right framework for thinking about cell phone towers. Former U.S. First Lady Lady Bird Johnson was a strong proponent for the beautification of America. She believed that billboards, ugly buildings, signs, and telephone poles negatively affected people's mental health and contributed to higher crime rates. So, her husband got to work. You know I love that woman, and she wants that Highway Beautification Act, and by God, we're gonna get it for her, President Johnson said. The bill, the Highway Beautification Act, was passed. It prohibited certain types of advertising along federally funded highways and interstates. And ever since then, committees, courts, and academics have rallied around the term visual pollution to declare their opposition to man-made additions to the landscape. As Nagel points out, cell towers are a new version of an old problem. In the early 1900s, people made aesthetic complaints about electric wires, telephone wires, and trolley cables as communities modernized. When neighbors took those complaints to court, courts often favored the power company or the phone company. As utilities, they had a legal right-of-way called eminent domain. The big question in all these cases was, is the aesthetic harm caused by a telephone pole something that deserves compensation? Once underground wires became available, cities and courts started requiring utilities to use those less objectionable-looking underground wires instead of the above-ground ones strung up on poles. With the rise of mobile phones in the 1980s came the rise of cell towers and resident complaints. Cell providers don't have eminent domain, so they have to persuade and sometimes pay private landowners to allow a tower on their property. The property owner gets paid, but the neighbors still have to deal with the visual pollution. In turn, they end up lodging complaints with local governments. Local governments got really adept at using zoning and other types of regulations to block cell phone towers from being built. That might have solved local aesthetic problems, but it created a new national problem. Too many restrictive local requirements would hinder the development of a national wireless communications network. So, Congress stepped in with a compromise. The Telecommunications Act of 1996. The TCA made it more difficult for local governments to block cell towers based on aesthetic concerns alone. The TCA requires the local government to provide substantial evidence that the cell phone tower would cause aesthetic harm to the community. Remember our friend Professor Nagel? In his paper, he asks, how does a local government show that there is substantial evidence that a proposed cell tower will result in an aesthetic harm? Well, he says, you could compile a stack of resonant complaints that the cell tower is ruining their view, but those are, in the words of one court, no more than individualized aesthetic opinions not based on any fixed standards. To really build your case, perhaps you could present some of the studies linking urban environments to psychological distress. There is evidence that our physical environment affects our mental health. It's also been shown that communing with nature is good for our mental health. But there is no conclusive study that specifically links the appearance of cell phone towers with negative mental health outcomes. So that might be a bit of a stretch. And Nagel's question still stands. How does one prove, objectively, that the tower is causing real aesthetic harm? The answer might lie in the way we handle other types of pollution. As Nagel points out, no environment is entirely free from pollution. Government agencies decide how much pollution is acceptable in the air, in our food, in the water. Cell towers provide a service that we all rely on and enjoy using. Nagel suggests that this arguably outweighs the minor aesthetic harm cell towers might cause. Nagel also points out that as we become used to things, they stand out less. Perhaps the longer cell phone towers are around, the less we'll notice them. Barbed wire, electric wires, and telephone poles all used to generate aesthetic complaints, and then we kind of got used to them. Or, in the case of phone lines, when a better solution came along, underground wiring, towns started requiring utilities to opt for in-ground wires. So, new technology could make towers obsolete, and the whole argument might become a moot point.
This is all a moot point.
Well, the argument about cell phone towers will become moot, but the next visual pollution claims are already on the horizon. Wind farm proposals are now generating all kinds of complaints that they're ruining views. Here we go again.
WHO, they say, is the keeper of the global knowledge on public health. It is present in 147 countries and has existed for 7 long decades with the sole purpose of, I'm quoting here, foreseeing and eradicating global health calamities. These are heavy words. The WHO's successes, to be fair, have been monumental, but so have been its failures. The coronavirus is among the biggest. It may very well be their last. First, the WHO downplayed the threat. Then it tried to cover up, and eventually it delayed the global response. Now, instead of admitting mistakes, it is preaching the world on how not to politicize a pandemic. Had the WHO shown some proactiveness and transparency, things would not have taken this turn. So here's the deal. We find the WHO responsible for leaving this world ruinously unprepared in the face of the coronavirus peril. And we have some questions tonight, 5 important and very basic questions that the health body must answer. Question number 1. Why did the WHO downplay human-to-human transmission? The coronavirus is not new. The transmission to humans is. And that is where the whole problem lies. January 14, the WHO said that preliminary investigations conducted by the Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission of the novel coronavirus. They bought China's word for it. And they did so when, in fact, just 12 days back, 41 patients had been admitted to a hospital in Wuhan. 14 of them had no direct exposure to the Hunan seafood market. That is 44% of the total cases. If this isn't human-to-human transmission, what is? Chinese scientists at the epicenter of the outbreak themselves confirmed this. One headline is on your screen. It talks about how only 27 of these patients had a travel history to the wet markets. And that's not all. A day before the WHO rejected human-to-human transmission on the 13th of January, Thailand reported its first imported cases of the coronavirus. This has been documented on the WHO website. Taiwan repeatedly warned them of such transmissions, yet the WHO remained in denial. So this is the first question they must answer. Why did they downplay or maybe lie about human-to-human transmission? Question number 2. Why did the WHO refuse to brand the outbreak a pandemic? By 15th January, the coronavirus was breaching borders. There was a trickle of cases in some countries. The WHO did not declare a global health emergency, which is fine. But another month and a half went by. The trickle of cases turned into a flood. By the end of February, there were cases on almost every continent. But the WHO did not call it a pandemic. It said the term, quote unquote, won't be appropriate yet. It was only on the 11th of March when the WHO Director General declared it appropriate after 57 days. I want to stress on this. The WHO declared a pandemic 57 days after the first cases were reported outside China. Do you know how many people had died in these 57 days? 4,000. That is more than 5 times the overall death toll of the SARS virus. Do you know how many people had been infected? 118,000. 118,000 people. What again classifies as a pandemic? What is a pandemic? Let's go by the definition on the WHO website. 24th February 2010, the WHO said a pandemic is the worldwide spread of a new disease. A worldwide spread. The coronavirus had spread to 80 countries on 6 continents by the end of February. Yet it did not fit the WHO's own definition of a pandemic. And in case you're wondering why the declaration of a pandemic is so important, I'll tell you why. It makes governments and health systems prepare for community transmission. Question number 3. What did the WHO delegation to China achieve? 28th January, a senior WHO delegation led by the Director General, Dr. Tedros, traveled to Beijing. They met with the Chinese leadership. 131 people had died by then. There were 4,600 cases across the world. The entire Hubei province was edging towards a lockdown. Do you know how optimistic this delegation was? Soumya Swaminathan, the WHO chief scientist, said, and I'm quoting, "It does look like, at least it's not growing, it's reducing." She means the virus. It's reducing. The number of cases outside China has not grown exponentially. That's not all. No data was shared with the US Center for Disease Control. The WHO delegation stayed in Beijing for days. They did not share any crucial data. The headline on your screen confirms this. The WHO delegation further delayed the global response. Question number 4. Why did the WHO change the name of the Wuhan virus? I've come with dates today. 11th February. There were coronavirus cases as far as the UK and the United States. The WHO still hadn't declared a pandemic. What it was busy doing was this: making sure that the name of this virus does not mention China. It renamed it to COVID-19. That's an acronym for Coronavirus Disease 2019, COVID-19. The WHO stressed on the year, not the place of origin. The WHO chief said that this gives them, and I'm quoting, a standard format for any future coronavirus outbreaks, which is great, but COVID-19 refers to the disease. The virus that causes the disease has been named SARS-CoV-2. Let me repeat that, SARS-CoV-2. Now, do you recall the WHO using this term? I don't, and I'll tell you why. Because according to the WHO, and I'm quoting again, using the name SARS can have unintended consequences in creating fear, especially in Asia, which was the worst affected by the SARS outbreak in 2003. So don't name China, don't name Wuhan, and don't even mention SARS. Basically, don't say anything that links this virus to China. Question number 5. Will the WHO ever acknowledge Taiwan's performance in this collective battle? Because that's what they call it, collective battle. After all, it was the first country, first region, to warn them about the threat. As early as December last year, Taiwan had released the contents of a December mail. A mail which raised 7 instances of a virus in Wuhan. The WHO took no note of this. The rest is history. Although that's not all. Taiwan has been excluded from the World Health Organization. Taiwan does not get an invite to attend WHO annual meetings. Taiwan does not get important briefings on global experts. Despite all of this, Taiwan is one of the success stories. Will the WHO acknowledge Taiwan's efforts, or will it continue to be bullied by China? In its attempts to not upset China, the WHO has failed to live up to its core mission, which is protecting human lives. It is time to demand accountability and ask questions.